Hey peeps, and welcome to another video. Today it is part 2 in the New Look 6560 sew along. So today we are going to be prepping the flounce, we're going to be prepping the ties, and we're also going to be prepping the yokes ready for sewing the blouse together. So let's get started. One thing you want to consider when you're just about to start cutting out your pattern pieces is if your pattern is directional or not. Now I think this one is non-directional because we're looking at it one way here, and then if we come around to the other side and have a look at it, it looks just as good because we have flowers going up that way as well as flowers coming down this way. So I think this is a non-directional print, at least in my eyes, so I'm going to treat it as such, which means that I can put my pattern pieces on here the best way that they fit, either the top being both down and up, as it were. But if you have a directional print, that's something you need to bear in mind. Okay, so I'm actually going to skip ahead to step number 4 and 5. I'm actually going to sew my flounce together, and then I'm going to finish the edge of the outer edge of my flounce, and I'm going to use my overlocker and do a narrow rolled hem on my overlocker. If you don't have an overlocker or you can't get yours set up to do this, then you can do what they have suggested, which is to machine stitch 5/8 of an inch in from inner edge of flounce, make a narrow hem, press under 1/4 of an inch on lower edge, stitch close to press edge, trim close to stitching, press under another 1/8 of an inch and stitch in place. I have my back flounce here, and these are my 2 front flounces, and I will of course be sewing the majority of this top with French seams. So I have pinned together the 2 short edges matching up the notches, and I've got the wrong sides facing each other, and you want to have the outside of the flounce on the matching up the outside of the back flounce, so the shorter curve is the neckline, the longer curve is the outside, and that's going to look something like, so I've got my flounce like this. Then you want to match up the notches like that, so you've got the inner curve going that way. I hope that makes sense. So I'm going to sew these at 1/4 of an inch, trim them down, press them, and then sew them at 3/8 of an inch to enclose the raw edges. And I'm doing that because this fabric is very sheer, so obviously all of my seam finishes will be visible from the outside, and I would like them to look as neat as possible. So for me, French seams are the way forward. Once you've sewn your seam at 1/4 of an inch, you want to trim your seam allowance in half. So there's my excess, so I now have a very narrow hem here of 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to take this to the ironing board, and I'm going to press it with the right sides together so I can finish this seam sewing at 3/8 of an inch to enclose this raw edge. Okay, so I have taken my work over to the ironing board. I've pressed the seam, I've then pressed it so that it's right sides together, and I've come back and I've sewn at 3/8 of an inch, which has enclosed that raw edge in there. I'm now going to press these seams towards the back, and then I'm going to use my overlocker to do a narrow rolled hem around the edge of the flounce. I've finished the outer edge of my ruffle with my narrow rolled hem function on my overlocker. I absolutely love this function. I think it looks really, really pretty. It's kind of given me a little bit of a lettuce leaf effect going on as well. I have my flounce done. Now the next thing I'm going to move on to is actually the ties, which are not on this. So you know how I like to jump around. The next thing that I'm going to work on is the ties. I'm going to be doing it slightly differently to how the pattern suggests, because I won't be making just a complete belt to then tie around independent of the top. I'm going to be attaching the ties to this so that it's an integral part of the wrap of the top. I have cut out 2 ties and 2 lining pieces, and I'm going to mount the ties onto the lining so that you won't be able to see any of the raw edges. And that again is literally that. I didn't want to sew this, pink it, and then have those pinked edges visible, so I have cut out lining. And I'm going to do the same thing with my yokes as well. So I'm going to get these mounted to the ties, and then I can get the ties sewn up to then be sewn to the top. I have the wrong side of the fabric to the wrong side of the lining. I mean, technically this lining doesn't have a wrong side, but you get the point. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sew around all 4 edges. I'm going to sew this 2 short edges first, and I'm not going to pivot and turn at the corners. I find that when I'm mounting fabric like that, it can sometimes get squiffy if you try and pivot and sew all in one go. I'm going to sew the 2 short ends first, then I'm going to sew one long end, and then I'm going to sew the other long end, and I'm just going to sew off of each of those edges. I'm not going to back stitch on any of them. I'm going to do that for both of the ties that I have. I'm also going to do the same for the yoke, but I'll show you that when I come to it. And for this step, you want to remember that you're sewing within your seam allowance. The seam allowance for this pattern is 5/8 of an inch, so we want to be sewing at 3/8 of an inch so that these lines of stitching won't show. I now have my outer fabric mounted to my lining fabric. I'm going to go give this a press. I did mess up a little bit because the seam allowance for stitching the ties together is 3/8 of an inch, and I have sewn at 3/8 of an inch on this, but that's okay. I will sew at 1/2 an inch when I'm sewing these together, and it will be fine. So the next thing that we want to do after I've given these a press is we're going to put it so that the right sides are together, and we're then going to sew up one long end and one short end. I want the ends of my ties to be slanted, so I'll be making a mark around about here so that I know where to pivot and turn to. Then we can trim and turn these through. This is different to how the pattern would like you to do it. They would like you to sew 2 of the short ends together to make one long big belt. But as I said, I don't want to do that. I don't like the button and ribbon closure method of shirts like this. I find those very annoying. So I want to make my ties an integral part of the shirt, which is what I shall be doing. So I'm going to get this pressed, and then I can get this pinned together and sewn into 2 separate ties. As I mentioned, I want the ends of my ties to be slanted. So I have taken my seam gauge. I've marked 1.5 inches in from this raw edge, made a mark, and I just used the straight edge to line up with this line of stitching here. So that will be my pivot point, and I will sew down to here and sew off of the end and secure that in place that way. So I will have nice slanted ties for my top. So I'm going to sew these at 1/2 an inch, which will just be inside this 3/8 of an inch seam allowance here. Sew these all the way along and pivot at this end, then we can then trim and turn them through. Okay, so I have clipped all of the excess seam allowance off. I have snipped up to my pivot point so that I'm going to get a nice point there, and I'm going to just do the same for this end here. Just take off that little bit of excess so I can get a nice pointy point. Now, because we have 2 layers of fabric, we need to turn this through slightly differently. Usually I would use a safety pin and kind of do it that way, but this time I'm going to fold it back on itself and kind of pull the fabric through this way, and that's so that we don't get anything caught or, you know, kind of turn through just one layer, not the 2 layers. Ask me how I know. So you just kind of want to feed your finger down, pull with this one, and kind of just pull a little bit of the excess fabric up. You can stuff some of the fabric into the end there, and then reach down, pull it through. So you just want to keep working this tie all the way through until you have it turned out the right way. So I'm going to do that. So tie number 1 down. I'm just going to finesse that little corner just a little bit more, very gently with my tweezers. Get that nice and pointy, and I'm going to give this a press, and I'm going to do exactly the same for this tie, and then our ties are done. Once you've pressed them, you should end up with some lovely looking opaque ties with a nice angled edge, and they should be 2 separate ties. So before we move on to the sewing instructions as per the pattern, I am going to mount the yoke pieces onto the lining pieces. So I've cut 4 lining pieces, and I have cut 2 of the outer fabric, and I'm going to do the same thing with these that I did with the ties. So I'm going to mount these wrong sides together onto the lining fabric so that this will then be treated as one piece of fabric, and I have the 2 spare yokes up here because you want 4 in total. So I'm going to do this the same way. I'm going to pin it all the way around. I'm going to sew 2 short edges, then the 2 long edges. If you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comment section down below and I will do my best to answer them for you. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!